On some surveys. To go along with this presentation, we do campus climate surveys, and the goal of that is to kind of get a feel for how the environment is on different college campuses. I did the same thing earlier today at Sac State, and this is something we do across the state, on college campuses, just to get kind of a reading of what the atmosphere is with Muslim students. So just kind of a disclaimer before the actual disclaimer. I don't want this to be like a lecture or a presentation, especially because there aren't like a lot of people in the room. I'd really appreciate if this is more of like a conversation. There's a lot of stuff that I'll be mentioning that you may or may have not experienced or know someone that may have experienced it. So if you want to participate in the dialogue and the conversation going on, then that would be great. So I'm just going to get right into it. I know it's a little late. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Usama Muqaddam. I am currently the Policy and Advocacy Manager at CARE Sacramento Valley. I just transitioned out of my position as Programs and Outreach Coordinator, where I was working primarily with youth development work in the region, as well as our statewide youth projects. I now work in the Capitol around policy affecting minority communities and Muslim communities across the state, across different demographics, whether they may be gender, race, age, etc., you name it. So if anyone is interested, this is kind of a sidebar in that kind of work, let me know. I'm happy to stay in contact with you all and just give you some insight into that. I work very closely with a lot of the Muslims in the building, in the Capitol, and that includes some really amazing and powerful alum from UC Davis, such as Maheen Ahmed, who's currently the legislative director for one of the assembly members in the Capitol. So we're really well connected. Aside from the KYR portion, CARE is here to help connect you guys with potential career paths if you're interested in any career path in policy, community organizing, even things around management, finance. We have positions that cater to those and help you grow within the context of advocacy. I say that because Yusuf right there is our new operations and development coordinator at CARE Sacramento. And he's a UC Davis grad himself. So I'll get right into it. We do this presentation, to make sure that we're conveying the information to Muslims across campuses in California, and to educate them on their rights, and give advice and sometimes legal advice. I'm not an attorney, so I can't give legal advice on what that may look like. And that's what this disclaimer is about. So the material covered in this presentation is purely for educational purposes. I am not a legal professional. I'm not bar certified, so I'm not authorized to give any legal advice, although I can point you in the right direction if you do have legal questions. Let's see. So what we'll cover today. So there are three main things we'll cover today, and I think these are applicable to students across campuses in California, and especially a campus like Davis, which is affiliated with MSA West. And there are a lot of projects that we collaborate with MSA West on in regards to know your rights, surveillance on campuses, etc. So we'll be talking about freedom of religion and touching a little bit upon religious accommodation and what that looks like on college campuses. Freedom of speech, what that looks like on college campuses. What are the limitations? What are your rights? And what do we do and what can we do in light of controversial speakers? And the last thing I'll be touching upon, which is probably the most important thing to myself, is the Countering Violent Extremism program, a surveillance program that is aimed at surveilling and criminalizing minority communities, and especially the Muslim community. And we'll talk about what that is, how to spot it, and kind of how to kind of mitigate or remediate the situation. So I'll just jump right into it. Does anyone have any questions up until now? Okay. I take those questions if you guys really have them, because you might not have a chance later on. So I'm really going to just run through some of this information, but feel free to stop me, raise your hand if you have any questions. No question is a dumb question. All questions, in my opinion, are beneficial and can be, can save someone's life, whether you feel it's small or not. So what are our constitutional rights? So the First Amendment to the Constitution states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, right? Within that, right, there are two specific protections outlined, right? There's the Establishment Clause and there's the Free Exercise Clause. This prevents Congress from promoting one religion over another and from restricting an individual's religious practices, right? What that means is not necessarily that the government, right, the Congress, the federal legislative branch in this country is not, allowed to protect a specific religion, right? AKA, in this case, maybe, people who are of the Muslim faith, right? It is not to favor any religion, right? So, and it's also, it doesn't mean that Congress protects no religion. Right? That's a little bit confusing, but I'll explain it a little bit deeper. For example, within the legal context, if there were one specific religion, and a lot of the time we think about the United States, and I'll touch upon this a little bit later. We think about it as a Christian country, right? But legally, speaking constitutionally, a Christian has no right over any other person of any other faith under the law, right? How that plays out, given social dynamics and power structures, is a whole different story. But legally speaking, that's what the reality is, right? And it's well established in the First Amendment, that this applies to colleges and universities. And this is a result of the Widmar versus Vincent case. Our cases leave no doubt that the First Amendment rights of speech and association extend to the campuses of state universities, right? So state universities, you have the UC, you have the CSU. Stanford would not fall under that, right? Private universities and privately funded universities do not fall under that category. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. There are different ways to address injustice within that system. Furthermore, within the state of California, I was just speaking federally, but within the state of California, within the California Constitution, this is also a protected class. So the free exercise and enjoyment of religion without discrimination of preference are guaranteed. The legislation shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, right? And again, this means that there should be no laws that establish, one religion as superior to another, or favorites a certain religion, or even focuses on a specific religious group within the context of education and the public sphere. And then in Article 9, Section 8, it says, no public money shall ever be appropriated for the support of any sectarian or denominational school, nor shall any sectarian or denominational doctrine be taught, or instruction thereon be permitted directly or indirectly in any of the common schools of this state. So now that we're behind all the boring lingo that I have to quote because it's law, I want to open it up and ask you guys, based on what you see every day, right? What does this, how do you interpret or perceive these 4 articles that I just mentioned? Very simple things, like some sisters in the room are wearing hijab, for example, right? Within the context of this, right, what might that mean? So the free exercise and enjoyment of religion without discrimination of preference are guaranteed. Let's break that down a little bit. Senna?
So freedom of religion is technically in schools, no open to like listening about your faith and just not beating against any certain religion.
Okay. You have another hand? Okay. That's a good point. So because there's diversity in faith on college campuses or school campuses, right? Some may stick out more than others, right? As in the case of a lot of Muslims who may look Muslim, right? Or like a lot of our Sikh brothers and sisters who outwardly look a certain way. Within that context, they're afforded the right to freely practice their religion, right? But the campus, right, or whatever public structure, legislative structure cannot favor that. So it cannot say that because someone looks a certain way or because someone practices a certain way that they're afforded, specific rights, right, in that context. So kind of to bring this into the light of everyday activities, right? So the free exercise and religious accommodations in universities, right? This is what you all are afforded as students at a public university, right? So frequent accommodation concerns on college and university campuses include prayer space usage, right? And issues around that, right? Prayer time issues, Ramadan obligations, exemptions such as exam accommodations, and religious attire and headwear issues, right? So I'll just go down the list point by point. For prayer space issues, alhamdulillah, there's been a lot of progress made in this light, right? A lot of college campuses now have meditation rooms, multi-faith rooms, etc., right? But there is still kind of a battle, right? Kind of structurally speaking and institutionally speaking on that end, right? A lot of college campuses have afforded their student population. You have, Davis has like an MSA size of like over 400 people registered, I think, right? And you have a prayer space that can only fit like 30 max, like foot, shoulder, shoulder, right? So it's like, within the context, right, or the ratio of, Muslims to space on campus, then, when you look at it critically, then you're not really afforded that much space. I had a conversation with Sac State MSA earlier, right? Sac State MSA was like, I think their meditation room was like 4 feet by 4 feet. So like maybe 3 brothers could pray in there. If a sister, if you want the gap, right, with the brothers and sisters, you're gonna have to wait, let alone Jum'ah, right? And a lot of the time what you have to do is get space accommodation somewhere outside, right? And it makes it a lot more tedious for student groups to do that. So what ends up happening, right, and what happened in the case of Sac State MSA is that, they pushed for more, right? They realized their university union was expanding, so this was an opportunity to expand the prayer space with it. So I'll get a little bit into more detail about, the ramifications and implications of that institutionally, but, I just want to put it on your radar that, prayer space issues, although you're afforded a space, it's not necessarily the required space you need, right? And Muslim students need to continue to advocate for that, because if it's not getting bigger, right? And I went to Berkeley myself, so I saw it with the meditation room there. It wasn't getting bigger, so we started losing certain privileges, right? Because Muslims weren't using it, right? And we see that with MSAs across the state where they fluctuate, right? Especially with like CSU and community college MSAs, is that the populations fluctuate. So sometimes you'll have a year where there's like a very active student population, and then the next year or 5 years later, you have a few Muslims that are active and using, the different resources that they have. And college campuses are continuously evaluating and reevaluating these spaces, and we should also continue to evaluate and reevaluate these spaces along with them. Yes.
More of a general comment, but just to kind of put it into people that are new. Davis's administration oftentimes kind of does a lot of pushback with the Muslim community now versus the past when they were in terms of that. So they actually did try to take away the reflection room last year, and we had to do a really big pushback, not only just to maintain the space, but to then further our rights. Zionist organizations have been complaining that we have gotten our own space, despite the fact that it's referred to as like a reflection room. And because of separation of church and state, they were having like issues with kind of having us like take over the space. So there are fluctuations where admin are going to kind of try to take away the things that they've already given us, but we had documentation to be able to push back. So just keeping that on your radar, inshallah, for the freshmen and transfers.
Thank you. Yeah, and these are issues, that fluctuate. And in the case of, the Davis Reflection Room, it goes back to the law around favoring one religious group over another, right? There are, unfortunately, a lot of groups that will target, a specific religious group, right? Or like the Muslim student group and say, hey, because they're using this more than everyone, right? You're favoring one group over another, right? But the law protects us, right? In that we're not, and of course this is kind of incumbent upon us to make sure that, we're affording that freedom to use the space to other groups, right? Although we may use it 90% of the time, right? There's potential for other groups to use it anytime, right? And I mean, in the case of Davis MSA, that was a huge, boost to their case. So thank you for that example. Another thing that I suffered from prayer time issues, right? And specifically within the context of classes, right? When I was talking about it earlier, one of the students asked me, like, for example, if I have certain professors where they may know that Muslims have, prayer obligations, and especially around like Maghrib time where you have a very, very short window. And, they're okay with it, they're fine. But I'll have another professor that, will be like, hey, but, I know a little bit about Muslim prayer times, and don't you have like a window, like, a certain amount of time? So what ends up happening is from quarter to quarter, right, speaking within the context of this campus, you'll have different salat times, right, throughout the day. In the spring, it's going to be, Maghrib is going to be much later than in the fall, right? And a professor that might have a class that's the same time, 2-3 quarters in a row, right? They might start to ask questions about why certain students are asking, to step out of class to pray at this time, whereas other students are asking to step out of class to pray at another time, right? And the way to kind of combat this, and the way I advise people to combat this, is through communication, right? A lot of the time, because certain classes have an X amount of Muslim students in them, or even practicing Muslim students, you have to take into account that the administration, whatever faculty present, may not know exactly what the details are. And this is kind of, responsibility on not only students, but like Muslim student leadership, to have some sort of educational program in place, right? And we do have care guides for, educators, right? The educator's guide that breaks down very well, 5 daily prayers, so like Som, right? Like all the different aspects of daily Muslim life that they should account for, when teaching students. And then there are other issues around prayer time where you have a professor that won't let you step out to go pray, for example, if you have an exam, right? And under the law, you're also protected in that light, right? But you should be more strategic about it, in that if you know you have an exam at a certain time, you take advance notice, right? And you communicate that. Again, the key word here is communication, right? You communicate that to your professor, or to, do you guys have GSIs? GSIs, TAs? Your TAs? Okay. They call them GSIs where I went to school, so it's like confusing. So TAs, right? So, or you communicate that to your TA, right, in section, and, make sure that they know beforehand that you have this obligation so that you can communicate it. And then if all else fails, right, come to care, right? We have attorneys on staff. Care is free, right? Care doesn't cost money. We have professional attorneys on staff that are trained, right, to write you letters, right, to your, again, this spans outside the realm of just school, to your educators, to your bosses, to your, who else? Your health practitioners, etc., right? And, they will write you a letter explaining how this is an obligation so that you don't have to do the heavy lifting, right? A lot of the time, as a student, right, within the power map or power dynamics, you don't really stand very high, right? But an organization that does this, an organization whose bread and butter this is, right, does stand pretty high out there, and they can hold faculty and they can hold administration accountable for these things, right? Accountability is huge when it comes to these things, and sometimes, as a student, you may not have, the power to hold, a professor accountable. We had a case with a student at Sac City College recently, right, that was taking an Arabic class, right, and the Arabic teacher wasn't Muslim but was Arab, right, and just started spewing hatred and stereotypes about Muslims, right? What the student did, right, was engage with that professor, right? Care didn't come into the picture until a lot later. But what happened in engaging with that professor is that professor has some control over that narrative, right? You make it a two-way road. Whereas if you just take in what the professor is saying and report it, right, then there's only one story. There's only one side to that story, right? And your case is much stronger in that light. And what happens a lot of the time is that students feel that this may not be a big thing, right? This might, I'll just ignore it. But what ends up happening is these, whether they're micro or macro aggressions, build up, right? And what ends up happening is that it'll hit a boiling point, at a certain time, and then you end up losing out and you have to backtrack, right, with your attorney before you can get justice through the system. The next thing, Ramadan obligations, right? And now we're seeing Ramadan is in the quarter system, you guys, all of Ramadan is during school, right? Yeah, so Sac State semester system, so they have finals during Ramadan. But for you all, it's not finals actually, no. But nonetheless, school, probably exams. But again, Ramadan obligations, fasting. Alhamdulillah, a lot of school campuses are being educated, right, on fasting and the obligations that students have, right? But it's still not enough, right? Again, the communication aspect, communicating with your faculty members, professors, right, TAs, department chairs, right, and even, office student life or whatever the equivalent is on this campus, and making sure that there's accommodations in place for folks that are fasting or need certain exemptions, right? And I'm a fan of addressing this in a systemic way, not on a case-by-case basis, because that way there will be a precedent set for Muslims to then treat it on a case-by-case basis. But you set the bar, and you don't set the bar really low, right? You set it at a good point to where you be afforded higher exemptions. In terms of religious attire and headwear issues, right? Again, this is very apparent for a lot of Muslims on campus, right? A lot of Muslim sisters, brothers who wear kufis or turbans. I know the beard isn't a thing anymore because everyone has a beard now. So it's that, it's not distinct to Muslims now, right? Everyone has a beard, so it's very hard for people to be targeted because, they have facial hair. I feel it, brother. I feel it. But yeah, so, again, religious attire, right, is protected, under the law, right? And if anyone, and especially if it's someone who is an employee of the university, right, discriminates against you or singles you out or treats you differently because of, your attire, right, then you are afforded those rights and you should hold them accountable, right? And if because of the power dynamics, right, because they're your professor and they control your grade that you don't feel comfortable, right, report it, right? CARE has a free, simple system to reporting cases, right? And you should utilize that, right? Again, I completely understand what it feels like to for someone else to have your grade in their hands, right? So don't stop at just, holding them accountable and maybe they retaliate, right? Hold them accountable systematically, right? So that they don't do this to someone else and that they understand that they will be held accountable not only individually but systemically, right, for their actions. So, any questions at the end of that? I know it's a lot. Yes.
Well, okay, so this is probably not really a question. But so I've had times I've had labs that's been multiple favorite times, and I've never really lab is one of those things where it's mandatory.
Yeah.
But I've never told anyone that I'm going to pay.
Yeah.
Kind of leave to use the bathroom. It was great. So like, do you think people should be communicating that often, or just say like, alright, like just tell them that you're praying, or does it not make a difference, or what do you think? Like,
So that's a very good question. So there are different parts to that, right? The way I understand it. Within your individual case, right, it would be okay to just continue doing what you're doing, but we have to think about it here in terms of setting precedent for people in the future, right? And for people who may or may not have that same privilege as you, right, in a lab class, right? Or if it's that same class, right, or if lab classes somehow, I don't know, take a turn and, you know, they want people to stay in the room because of whatever reason, right? You know, health risks, whatever. Then, you know, you can't be like, oh, I used to go pray, right? And my professor was cool with it. It's just kind of, you can't, what you experienced doesn't really have much standing, right? Because it wasn't communicated, right? So for the sake of, you know, taking a proactive and preemptive approach for the future, right? I would say that you do communicate that, right? And that way it'll at least be documented, maybe in an email, right? And even state that, you know, I usually just step out to use the bathroom. Is that okay, right? Or like, is it okay if I just continue using that? It doesn't seem like a problem up until now, right? If they change it up on you and act different because of that, then you hold them accountable. You report it, right? And there's a trail. There's a paper trail. What I advise everyone is keep documentation. When you communicate with professors, right, or faculty, other faculty, grad students, TAs, keep a paper trail. If you talk to someone verbally, email them and say, hey, it doesn't take long. Hey, you know, we talked about this earlier, you know, or like, you know, if you've come to a conclusion, you know, just state it and then say, you know, thank you for your time. Boom, right? And there it's documented, right? They received it. They can't say, oh, we didn't talk about that, right? Because you documented it and you sent it forward. It might not be something, you know, it doesn't necessarily have to be done with anything that's like normal, right? But if it's like kind of a borderline grade, or if you feel like your Muslim identity might put you at risk in this situation, I would always keep documentation, right? Because that's ultimately what is going to build your case. Inshallah, none of you guys get to that point, right? But again, we're here to set precedent so that future generations are protected, right? You're going to be on this campus for 3 to 5 years max, right? So it's very, very strategic, right, as Muslims. And I think there's a reason why everyone is in this room on a Thursday night at 8:45 p.m., right? When you could be doing so many other things, right? It's because you care. And if you care, you want to make sure that, you know, the fruit of your labor is, you know, consumed by the future generations. So, and it doesn't take much to, you know, set that precedent. Any other questions or comments?
So I know that like Ramadan is a big thing for Muslims, and like we have like technically an exemption, but like how far can it be stretched? Like I don't assume that you can have certain deadlines postponed just because you're fasting. It would be like, I don't know, like what is the most that you can get out of the month, like the month of Ramadan? That's like, yeah, like what's like, or what cases have you seen where like you have, I don't know, like supported someone in the case of the illustrious? I know that on Davis, there's certain groups that are trying to pass resolutions to educate like professors about Ramadan itself.
Yeah.
Well, what has CARE done, or what have you guys done in like just helping students out with that case?
Yeah. So again, this is one of those things that just specifically with us, we operate on a case-by-case basis with. But to answer your first question about how much could you get out of Ramadan, I would say, you know, think about it within like a reasonable like load, right? Your goal shouldn't be to, you know, maximize how many deadlines you could push or anything like that, right? Essentially, if the school is offering some sort of accommodation, right, that should be your line, right? If there's some sort of accommodation, again, right? There's a lot of health reports, science, Dean, everything will say like your cognitive abilities are heightened during Ramadan. So individually, this is just my personal advice. Individually, you shouldn't sell yourself short, right? When it comes to taking exams or going to class, right? While fasting, but if it affects your health, things like that, then if there's no systemic exemptions put in place through the campus, I would contact CARE and ask them, if they're able to, write a letter on your behalf or whatnot. And of course, we treat it on a case-by-case basis as well, and we won't just write a letter blindly and send it. We'll contact your professor. And again, if your professor is like, I gave him accommodation and he pushed it again, and now he's asking you for a letter, then that's not going to look really well on you. So there are ways, for people to find it. But I say educating like the campus so that there are those exemptions put in place in case someone needs them. All right. We good? All right, on to freedom of speech. This is like a really hot topic among campuses. This is probably the highlight topic of my college years, because all the Milo Yiannopoulos and Ann Coulter stuff was going on at Berkeley at the time, and there were like huge riots and things like that. So I want to break it down just to kind of let you all know what is okay. Some of this might make you mad because some of the stuff that you might not be okay with personally is okay legally, so stuff like that. So the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution states that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. So this generally means that restrictions on speech by public colleges and universities amount to government censorship in violation of the Constitution, right? So what happens there is, students have a protected right to invite speakers they wish to hear, or speech they wish to hear, debate speech with which they disagree, and protest speech they find bigoted or offensive, right? Every student, Muslim or not, is entitled to those three things, right? So when someone brings a speaker that you don't like, right, they're entitled to hearing that person, but you're also entitled to protesting that person, right? So again, this is a matter of organizing, right, and what the Muslim community deems offensive or not offensive. And how you interact and react to those things. However, the First Amendment does not protect speech or behavior that is targeted harassment or threats, or that creates a pervasively hostile environment for vulnerable students, right? So that's a very broad thing to say, right? What does that mean, right? If a speech or behavior is targeted at a certain group, right? So if I say these Muslims, right, are a sickness to our society, and then incite violence, that's hate speech. That is not protected under the First Amendment, right? So again, holding folks accountable to that is extremely important, right? And again, what happened with, and I use the example of like Milo Yiannopoulos at Berkeley, was what happened with him is that many folks protested, not many folks addressed it with the administration, right? So if you protest things and you write letters to the ASUC, or what's the student body here? Oh, ASUCD. Okay, same thing. So, and you write letters to them, but you have certain members of the ASUCD that are inclined, to let someone like this speak on campus. You address it with administration, right? You address it with the student life whatever, coordinator or manager or director or whatever. So again, it's a matter of action, right? A lot of these things are roughly defined, but how you react to them is extremely important in these cases. So limits of protected speech. The First Amendment does not protect behavior or speech on campus that consists of targeted harassment or threats, including intimidation. And generally, harassment includes unwanted, unwelcomed, and uninvited behavior that demeans, threatens, or offends the victim, right, and results in a hostile environment, right? So if someone walks in this room, right, and starts screaming at me and starts saying, you terrorists, you, etc., that is harassment, right? and that is not protected. So I can literally call campus security and be like, can you please take this person out of this room? But if somebody was outside, right, in whatever quad is close to here, and it's, you know, kind of addressing me, calling me a liar, calling me a hateful speaker, I don't know, calling me whatever general, you know, I guess name you want to use, right? That is protected, right? It's not unwanted, it's not unwelcome, it's not uninvited, right? Yes.
So, to understand what you just said,
Yeah.
calling you a terrorist would mean that's considered harassment, but that's not just bigoted speech. Like, how do you draw the line between bigoted speech?
So if someone came in here and called me that, right? It's unwanted, right?
Well,
Under the guideline of harassment, right? Under the law, right? It's unwelcomed and it's uninvited, right? So, go ahead.
that's all bigoted speech.
Yeah, but that's why I was saying if someone was doing that out in the quad, right? It's not really interfering with this space, right? Or this gathering, this space right here. Yeah. So
what's
that.
the difference between this space and the quad? Like, in terms of we're still in public.
Yeah, I mean we're not.
In terms of like the legal point of view.
Well, we're not still in public. So.
This is public.
So there's under the law there's a certain expectation that this room serves has a certain privacy aspect to it. So once you cross that line, then it's no longer like it's not really a public space, right? So there's that expected privacy, right? So did that kind of explain it? Go ahead.
So you talk about reasonable expectation of privacy, but what parameters are we talking about? Because for me, I think of reasonable expectation of privacy like, can I see inside this room? Can I hear what's inside this room? Right? Like, is that like an open door, closed door type of thing? Because we can be in a gathering, we can be in space, but it could be the meditation room, but I don't have any reasonable expectation of privacy in there because it's an open room.
Yeah.
Right? So what's the threshold there?
Yeah, I mean, so I want to break it down in like the clearest way possible. So with this room, for example, it's reserved. Well, I assume it's reserved, right? It has a specific purpose, right? From a specific time to time. That already outlines a certain aspect. So, for example, if we weren't using this room, or if we were outside and someone comes and starts using this room, right? We can come inside and be like, excuse me, like we're entitled to this room, correct? So just that in itself, right, it gives you a certain level of ownership over this space, right? And you see, for example, when you have a lot of protests that go on, right, when there's a speaker speaking, a lot of the protesters will stand up, speak, and then leave, right? Because within that space, that is unwanted, like speech, right? It doesn't necessarily it's not necessarily outlined as hate speech, right? But there's a level of harassment that is outlined within that space, right? So it's not necessarily hate speech or bigoted speech, but there's a certain level of disturbance of that space that's attributed to it. Does that make sense? Whereas if you're out in the quad, then there's a reasonable expectation of privacy, or the reverse. It's public, right? There isn't that reasonable expectation of privacy, right? So
it's just the second question that I get off of that is that this is a public event. So in having a public event, even though you have reserved a space, it's like a little bit of a fine line, because if it was a private event, and if it was like ticketed members only, you need a ticket or you need a pass to get in. Do you see how that kind of separates it in a way?
Yeah, it touches upon it a little bit later in the presentation. That's a really good question, and that specific scenario is like touched upon. So I'll hold it for a little bit later. So the First Amendment, just to continue, does not protect on-campus behavior that creates a pervasively hostile campus environment, right? As this may limit a student's ability to participate in or benefit from a school's services, activities, or opportunities. And that kind of outlines your example, right? So there's that second aspect to it, right? So if it inhibits you, right, if someone disturbing this space inhibits you from benefiting, right, from this service that's being provided, right, then it's considered disturbing that space. Make sense? Just for that question, I'll address the other one later. However, merely offensive or bigoted speech does not rise to this level. Determining when conduct crosses this line is a legal question and requires a case-by-case examination, right? So just kind of to talk about the details, again, I'm not an attorney. I provided you with just my opinion, not as a legal expert, right? But just from what I have seen, my observations. But legal experts will be able to tell you exactly like what the boundaries are, what crossing that line looks like, both verbally and physically, right? Because sometimes, you know, there's a mix of both. You might not be verbally crossing the line, but you might be physically, and then vice versa. So, harassment on campus. Under California law, if repeated incidents of harassment or a single severe incident of harassment occurs at a college or university, the school's administration must act upon receiving notice of the complaint. And always plug this, care, right? If you believe you or an organization are a part of has been subject to harassment, contact your local CARE California chapter, right? We're not legal experts. I'm not a legal expert. If even me, I've been working at CARE for like almost 2 years now, right? Even if I experienced harassment, right, or a hate crime or an incident, I don't go back to the office and be like, hey, this is what I experienced. I get on my laptop, I file an incident report, I send it to our attorney, and then I go tell him, right? Because I know that that documentation is really important, and documenting ASAP is extremely important because everything's fresh in your mind. So, time, place, and manner restrictions. And this is kind of to talk a little bit more about the physical aspect, right? Public colleges and universities may regulate time, place, and manner of speech in public forums using reasonable restrictions if the regulations are viewpoint and content neutral. What does that mean, right? So if your public university isn't enforcing a rule for other clubs, they can't enforce it against you and probably should be challenged for discriminatory enforcement, right? This is really important in the case of the MSA or the SJP, where they're being pitted against what other clubs are doing, right? And historically, UC Davis has been subjected to a lot of this discriminatory enforcement, right? So the First Amendment and free speech principles require that rules be viewpoint neutral. So if the MSA has a certain view, right, and it's being, you know, enforced against strictly, right, and then another student club holds the same or similar view, right? Or maybe holds a similar view style or manner, right, of viewpoint, and they're not being enforced against, that's discriminatory enforcement, right? And you should challenge your campus if that's the case, right? And again, contacting, you know, CARE and having an attorney, because only attorneys can, you know, break down and identify whether that is truly discriminatory enforcement. Otherwise, it'll just be a subjective interpretation of what's discriminatory and what's not. My club, your club, you know, everyone believes what they're doing isn't discriminatory, right? So it takes, you know, legal representation to determine what truly is, right? Generally speaking, a school must be able to communicate an important and probable rationale, such as a specific and realistic threat to campus security or academic environment, in order to invoke such an exclusion, right? So there are guidelines under which, you know, campus can make certain exclusions, right? So even if time, place, and manner restrictions exist, such regulations must allow for alternative channels of communication, and if they prevent you from getting your message to your intended audience, or if they're differently applied to certain groups, then it's likely to be unconstitutional, right? Again, if such regulations don't allow for alternative channels of communication, right, and they prevent you from getting your message across, and the same is not, you know, enforced on other groups, then there's a high chance that is unconstitutional, and there's a high chance that is discriminatory exclusion. So schools can only restrict the speech to the extent necessary to avoid the specific communicated rationale. Valid limitations that a school can invoke include: 1, requiring advance notice, requiring groups to obtain permits, or specific registration policies, right? So for example, right, exclusion doesn't include you getting your permits, right, your advance notice, and you do the specific registration required, right? And then you conduct your event and they come and shut you down, right? It does not include that, right? So if you follow those guidelines, right, and you're running your event and they come and shut you down, right, was that without like a reasonable cause, then that is unconstitutional. Some invalid restrictions, right? Schools are prohibited from using time, place, and manner regulations to unreasonably restrict student protest or otherwise chill speech, right? So they can't, for student protest, they can't say like, oh, you're restricted by certain things. And I'll go into it a bit more. Regulations that limit free speech to 1 to 2 areas of campus or require prior administrative approval for all expressive activity are overly restrictive and are not reasonable time, place, and manner regulations. Again, regulations that limit free speech to 1 or 2 areas of campus or require prior administrative approval for all expressive activity. So what this means is if the MSA can only protest in 2 specific areas, right? I don't know. I'm not gonna act like I know Davis like that, but any area that you might think isn't, reasonable, right? They're like, oh, you can protest, but you got to do it at the dairy courts, right? You can't do that. And then like, it's not reasonable, and then they give you one other option, then that is not protected under the time, place, and manner regulations, right? So it's generally acceptable areas for protected speech include outdoor plazas, student union buildings, and other spaces to open to the public on your school campus, right? So outdoor plazas, student union buildings, and other public and open spaces. And campus policies related to obtaining permits for speech must contain exceptions for spontaneous responses to unfolding events, right? What this means is if you have an action alert that goes out, right? And I'll stop right here real quick just to say the surveys, if you have to go, then you could just drop them off right here before you go. I know some people left. We'll collect them from them later, but that's okay. Where was I? Spontaneous events, right? So for example, yesterday we saw the atrocities that are happening in India, right? With the Muslims being literally lynched, in public, right? If you wanted to schedule an action, right? A spontaneous response to an unfolding event, right? You are afforded exceptions in that light, right? Campus can't say, oh, you have to wait 3 weeks to do that, right? Because it's something that is spontaneous, right? And it requires a response. It requires an action, right? As long as it falls within, again, advance notice, or not, in this case, not advance notice, I'm sorry, but specifically contacting the campus, right? And contacting administration, right? Then you're afforded that exception. So the right to protest. Right? So kind of to break this down a little bit. The right to protest is a well-established free speech protected activity. Generally, you should be able to protest in outdoor areas, including streets and plazas on your campus. However, these protests may be subjected to reasonable time, place, or manner restrictions. Right? Again, your school cannot seek to restrict your ability to protest because of the content of your protest. So this is really interesting. Right? If you're gathering 400 people, right, in like the lobby right here, right? You may be subjected to reasonable time, place, or manner restrictions, right? But, if you're out in the glade, right, and you have 400 people and you want to talk about how you don't like that these chairs are green, right? You can do that, right? They can't restrict you based on the content, right? So you could talk about whatever you want. Right? And unfortunately, inversely, other people could talk about whatever they want, right? As long as it doesn't, as long as it can be subjected to time, place, and manner restrictions. So your school cannot seek to restrict that ability to protest, and they may restrict speech, including protests that unduly interfere with classes. And this is what a lot of students ask me, right? Is that why do they allow protests in a certain area but not in another, right? If you're protesting right outside here and there's a class going on and they restrict you, right? That's because there's unduly interference, right? There are classes going on. It goes back to what we were talking about earlier about interfering right, the services that are being provided in that space. So having outside speakers on campus, right? Public colleges and universities are free to invite whomever they like to speak at commencement ceremonies or other events, just as students are free to protest speakers they find offensive, right? A lot of campuses don't do this, right, to their full capacity, even though they might agree with like Milo Yiannopoulos as keynote speaker for commencement, right? But they don't because, again, student alumni are donors, right? There's a huge system that, the system of education is a huge economic system, right? And you want to stay as close to the middle as possible. So they invite relatively non-controversial speakers, right? But if they do invite someone you feel is controversial, right, that's their right, and it's your right to protest. And schools are limited in their ability to control or restrict which speakers student groups choose to invite on campus, right? Unfortunately, and I'll get your question in just a second. Unfortunately, right, there are a lot of speakers that student organizations bring to campuses, right, that spew hate, they spew bigotry, right? And schools are very limited in their ability to control which speakers they can and cannot bring. Senna.
It's kind of like on the last, so like a lot of times like I guess the club will like bring like super Zio speakers, like even though that it's one like completely against like what we as Muslims like Palestinian students believe in, but like also it's just against a lot of like basic human rights. So would it be okay to bring that speaker even though it's still offensive?
Yeah, so again, unfortunately, right, as far as the school institution goes, it's limited in its ability to control that, right? They could be speaking against all human rights, right, but they're entitled to that speech under the law, right? That's their opinion, unfortunately, right? So, and again, right, that goes for the inverse, right? If you feel like speaking about something, that is your belief or your opinion, you are protected under the law, right? So it kind of goes both ways, and it opens up the conversation about how do we properly educate people, right, to prevent these things from happening rather than reacting and protesting them when they do happen, right? So again, that's just some food for thought. And inviting controversial speakers, while schools are not required to provide a platform to anyone, they're prohibited from restricting speech on the basis of the speaker's viewpoint, right? So it's a really like catch-22 situation, right? Where like you're not really required to, give anyone a platform, but you also can't restrict that platform. Schools may not ordinarily book a club from inviting a speaker that is controversial, even if she or he may arouse strong feelings, passions, and even hostility. Block a club, right? So again, a speaker might make you mad. A speaker might, cause you to want to, react. But again, the school cannot block that speaker from coming, on behalf of a club. And schools may not charge your club additional security costs because they believe the speaker to be controversial. If your school usually provides funding or use of campus resources such as amphitheaters for invited speakers, the school cannot withhold those resources simply because students have invited a controversial speaker. And this is kind of what the brother mentioned about ticket prices, right? So if you invite Milo Yiannopoulos, there is a chance that, there might be some violence, right? In the case of Berkeley, there were riots, right? But what they cannot do is upcharge the tickets for that event, right? People might want to buy tickets, right, to go in and protest, right? But what they cannot do is upcharge based on projected security costs, right? So you're making a profit, right? There are laws protecting against that, right? But at that point, you're making a profit off of, something that you allowed to happen. So again, that would be a breach of that protection. Okay, any questions, concerns, answers, hypothetical scenarios under that last section before I move into the final section? Okay, so the fun stuff, right? CVE, or Countering Violent Extremism Programs, right? So CVE officially started in 2014 under the Obama administration. So for those of you that, held the belief that community surveillance started under Trump or under Bush. That's not true. There was a lot of big surveillance programs that started under the Obama administration as well. The CVE pilot programs began in Boston, LA, Minneapolis, and Montgomery County in Maryland, right? And CVE essentially aims to deter people from joining violent extremist groups by bringing community and religious leaders together with law enforcement, health professionals, teachers, and social service employees to monitor particular populations. The program gives major grants, and this is how they operate. They give major grants to community and law enforcement organizations in exchange for information about potential or suspect individuals who are exhibiting warning signs of radicalization, right? So sorry to tell you all, but the fact that you're in this room today under these guidelines, you are exhibiting warning signs of radicalization, right? So moving forward. The indicators, right? CVE depends on radicalized indicators that often and primarily target the Muslim community. So having or maintaining a beard or hijab is an indicator. Joining a student club, particularly MSA or SJP, is an indicator. And going to the mosque is indicator. How many people here tick off all three? That's like a big chunk of the room, right? So basically, right, if you engage in anything a normal Muslim does, then you are at risk of being radicalized. On the flip side, right, some indicators are so broad that they allow labeling people as radicalized just by doing anything. So if you're between the ages of 16 and 24 and you spend 3.5 hours or more on your phone, then you check off one of the indicators, right? And I doubt there is a single human being between that age, right? I want to meet them if they're on their phone for less than that much per day. Demonstration of mistrust of law enforcement, right? And this was used against Somali young men and teenagers, right? And here it mentions Somali young men is because a lot of black brothers, specifically black men, right, face a lot of discrimination, right, and face a lot of harm and marginalization at the hand of law enforcement, right? And for a lot of Somali brothers, right, young Somali men, right, they're Muslim. A lot of them. It's a primarily Muslim majority country, right? And it's a black majority country, right? Demonstrating any mistrust or distaste towards law enforcement, right, also checks that off. So if you're walking down the street, right, and out of fear, of law enforcement, you're high alert, or when someone tells you hey, call the police, and you're like, no, I'm not going to call the police because I don't know how it's going to go down, right? Then you check off that indicator. Academic failure, right? People academically decline based on so many different factors, but I guess it's an indicator. And then engaging in unidentified concerning behavior. So just to finish that off, if you haven't checked off any of those normal things, right, you can go ahead and be subjected to potential radicalization, right, if law enforcement deems any of your behavior concerning. So basically, you can't do anything without being radicalized. So, spotting CVE, right? Does anyone have any questions? I get some questions sometimes at the end of that part, so I just want to make sure that I open the floor. I know MSA West is doing a huge anti-CVE campaign. How many of you all have heard of it or are a part of it? Okay, cool. Cool. Okay. So, and now I want to let you all know it's not called CVE anymore, right? So, and it's not called PVE anymore, right? So I'll explain a little more. Again, the government's really quick with this name change, right? They change the name very often because once you catch on to it, it's very easy to attach it to CVE, because CVE leaves a bad taste in people's mouth. Everyone knows CVE is harmful. And it's not only to the Muslim community. CVE has been employed in the black community, right, and has been very detrimental there, right, and it's been employed in other marginalized communities and has been very detrimental there. So once anyone, Muslim or non-Muslim, hears CVE, right, then the red flag goes up, right? And they changed it to PVE, right? Preventing violent extremism, right? As if they're trying to be slick. But now, when people hear PVE, they know, right? So they changed it to SCS, right? Or CSC, sorry. California Safe Communities, right? Yeah. So they're changing the names up, right? And how you spot it is through funding, one, right? So if there's an organization, right, and the funding comes from either the Department of Homeland Security or the Department of Justice or law enforcement, like the Sheriff's Department, right, then that's a huge red flag, right? But sometimes the money is hidden and embedded through these community organizations, right? So what will happen, and I'll include the case of a local organization, right, that engages in this program, right, and give the example of that. Another thing is branding, right? CVE is often marketed as building resilience or community-driven approaches to violent prevention. And these programs claim to teach the community how to identify suspects based on indicators, right? So one of you all will go get training on how to identify suspects, right? You'll be indoctrinated, and then you'll get paranoid because everyone around you prays and goes to MSA meetings and is generally suspicious because, I don't know, like they're always on their phone or something, right? So that's how these programs brand themselves. And another indicator or how to spot this program is through the participants, right? It includes law enforcement, schools, mental health specialists, and or religious leaders, right? What do all four of these have in common? This might be kind of a tough question for this time of day. There's a lot of commonalities, but I'm thinking of one thing in particular. Huh? That's not the one I'm thinking of, but that's true, right? I'll explain it within the context of that as well. Give one more chance, anyone? They interface with people directly, right? They're on the ground, right? Law enforcement is on the ground. Schools interact with children directly and parents. Mental health specialists, right? And that's where the authority comes in, right? All of these have authority, right? And that builds trust, right? With that authority comes trust, right? And religious leaders, right? So there's the spiritual, right, trust. There's the mental health trust, right? And there's the everyday, physical trust, right? And academic trust, right? So protection physically from law enforcement, protection academically from schools, teachers, protection from mental health specialists, and protection from religious leaders, right? So these four things encompass a human's everyday life, right? So these different, right, roles are co-opted by, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and in California by the California Office of Emergency Services, which is an office that operates within the governor's realm of influence, right? Targets, right? Another thing is how, by and large, the target audience of these programs are the Muslim community or other communities of color, right? So that's a red flag as well, right? When you see a organization that, is receiving extreme levels of funding, right, came out of nowhere, and they're serving one specific community, right, that's a red flag. Although, right, it may not necessarily mean that they are taking CVE funding, but it necessitates that investigation, right? So, and then information exchange, right? This includes a mechanism to gather data about the community members, such as after-school programs that collect rosters of team members or mental health specialists that provide information of people that might be at risk of radicalization, right? And I'll mention that last point, the mental health specialists that provide information of people that might be at risk. I'll touch upon that in my example, right? Again, the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services, Cal OES, right, is modeled on their PVE program, right, which they're working to revamp, right, is modeled on CVE frameworks designed by agencies like the DHS and FBI. And Cal OES, through funding from the DHS, I think their term ends in March, but has dispersed nearly $625,000 to groups around the state, right? And there were 6 groups that took this funding, right? They've been identified. One of them is BRAVE, which is a teacher training program in Southern California at San Bernardino, right? Another one is right here in our backyard. I don't know how many of you guys have heard of Opening Doors, right, in Sacramento, right? It's an organization that focuses on refugee resettlement and education, right, and provides mental health resources, and especially to vulnerable women who have been victims of domestic abuse, right? So let's draw out a hypothetical scenario where, someone is engaging in these programs, right, and she is a victim of domestic abuse. What will happen, right, is her family, her husband, right, her children will be in the system, right? And what will happen is they will flag this case, right, of domestic abuse, and they will use that as an indicator for her husband being potentially radicalized. So someone who, would have gone to court or have been held accountable for domestic abuse may now face terrorism charges, right, because they abused their family at home, right? So you see how this will further highlight, right, or further aggravate certain, again, they're still serious issues, right? But as you see with a lot of refugee families and refugee populations, they come from very broken societies, right? And they suffer social issues that are suffered in broken societies, right? Where there are very little mental health, right? Education resources, social services, etc., right? So you see a lot of these infractions within those households, right? And rather than taking approaches that educate, right, and increase that sense of accountability, we're now deeming mainly young men, right, and especially in like the Afghan population in Sacramento, because that's a huge refugee population that's been kind of funneled into the Sacramento region. We're seeing a lot of these young Afghan men being, taken in on potential, terrorism or being surveilled. They don't necessarily have to be charged or convicted, right? But they are being surveilled, right, by the FBI or other federal law enforcement agencies because, they show these indicators of radicalization. You had a question?
I'm thinking of 2 levels.
Yeah.
Question, you have like reasonable suspicion and then you have probable cause. So when you talk about that hypothetical situation, you talk about family and having domestic abuse in that layer, I can think that you have probable cause for that. But then when you bring in the violent extremism portion of it, it's kind of, to build that bridge, I'm guessing you would need probable cause.
So reasonable suspicion and probable cause are good to keep in mind when you get pulled over or you commit, a crime or whatnot. But for federal agencies,
I'm thinking
right?
Because even in a federally minded idea, and even with federal agencies and stuff like that, they still have mandates that they have to work.
Yeah. So let me draw us. So, for example, the Department of Homeland Security engages with an organization and signs a a memorandum of understanding, right? Entitling them to a certain amount of funding, but also asking for certain reporting protocol, right? Or certain deliverables, right? And those deliverables may be, hey, if somebody ticks off this indicator, right, then, put them on the list, right? Send us that list, right? And they don't go and pick them up, right? Because of that, they will surveil them, right? The FBI will visit them, right? And then when the FBI visits them, they may engage with them in conversation, and when the FBI, kind of targets, and we've seen it post 9/11, when they target, the Muslim community, they don't need you to incriminate yourself, right? The probable cause is if you tell them, I was on campus Tuesday, and then the next time they talk to you, you say, I wasn't on campus Tuesday, right? Then that's a very, that's kind of a lapse in the information you're giving them, right? And that's a reasonable suspicion to bring you in, right? And that's how the FBI does target a lot of the community.
With that example that you giving
Yeah.
a lapse in information.
Yeah.
Seeing that that would be considered reasonable suspicion. For reasonable suspicion, from what I know about it, it's always if you're committing a crime, you're engaged in activity connected to a crime, and you have committed a crime. It's one of those three things. So like when you talk about lapse in time, is there that can't be the only factor supporting your reasonable suspicion.
So they can bring you in. That's enough for them to bring you in and question you. And then that door opens up anything for any possibility. So, and we've seen this is, you know, again, for example, the Hammett Hyatt case, right? Many of you have heard about it probably. He just got acquitted officially last week, right? And he was convicted, right? Falsely convicted, right? And served 14 years, right? And that's purely because, right, he was pressured to say, you know, I was in Pakistan doing a certain activity, right? And he didn't want to, but his alibi had an inconsistency. So that was enough for the FBI to bring him in, right? And after the FBI brings you in, then they're open to intimidating you, right? Whatever they, you know, they employ to get information out of you or whatnot, right? If you don't have legal representation, right, then, you know, it might be downhill, you know, from there. And that's why these programs are harmful, because there's that mass exposure, right? CVE, right? It's not necessarily that everyone's going to be locked up, right? Everyone's going to be, you know, like charged, you know, on certain charges or convicted of certain charges. It's the fact that you have mass databases of community populations that are being surveilled, right? Which leaves open the potential for any of them to be subjected to this type of intimidation from federal law enforcement. So, and that's kind of like where this program really like thrives. Yes?
So based on the parameters you provided some time ago as to what would qualify as you getting surveilled or put on a list,
Yeah.
wouldn't fall under, honest to God, almost any community? I mean, you mentioned they're extremely broad, but...
Yeah, and I mean,
wouldn't they apply to majority white communities as well?
Yeah, but I mean, they don't target those communities. That's the only difference, right? If you go to an organization that serves 95% Afghan and Syrian refugees, right, that's your clear target, right? You can go to the Boys and Girls Club, right, that might have a more diverse demographic, right, and give them that funding, but for the purposes of those agencies, it doesn't serve their needs, right?
But like, let's say you have a lot more traffic in the Boys and Girls Club of America.
Yeah.
Which does sound about right when you compare it to open doors and stuff like that. Wouldn't that get you a much larger sample size and a much larger, more diverse, quote unquote, pool of applicants to pick out for this profile? Yeah,
but I mean, it comes down again to the purpose of these projects. Like, you know, why are you targeting this community? Like post 9/11, right? There has been a narrative that's been painted around the Muslim community, right? And there's certain goals behind making sure this community is excluded from society, right? So these programs are going to be designed, right, to target this specific community. They're not going to be designed to target whatever, you know, community other organizations serve, right? And just naturally, you know, if I'm looking for a specific demographic, I'm going to go to an organization that has 90% of that demographic that they serve, right? Rather than an organization that may have some of that demographic and other demographics. Because what other demographics don't concern these agencies, right? The demographics that concerns them, and especially with a lot of these refugee resettlement programs, right? And preventing extremism or terrorism, right? The higher probability of extremism comes in these refugee communities, right? And post 9/11 came in Muslim communities because it could directly be correlated with the attacks on September 11th. Yeah. Any other questions? I love the questions, by the way. I love like talking about these things.
I'm just thinking of different like, levels and layers, and like based on what I've learned and based on what I've seen, like some things to me are like, oh, that sounds like an egregious constitutional violation. But then the way you're prefacing it is like, oh, that's a federal thing.
So
The way that I'm thinking of it is like, I'm trying to think of it on like a ground up level.
Yeah.
So, like, at what point does that level start to change? Because I can think of like a couple different scenarios where that stuff like that wouldn't really fly. But I can understand how you're coming from it because it's a federal.
Yeah, again, from an advocacy and policy perspective, because that's where like my expertise lies, you're right? Because again, and right now we're working on passing, for example, passing policy, right, that prevents like joint terrorism task forces between federal and local law enforcement, right? Because what those partnerships can do, right, is very harmful, right, and reduces the sense of accountability. Anything outside of that, I would talk to an attorney. They could probably explain it way better than me in terms of the federal, state, and local level and how it looks at each of those levels. And yeah, I think that's, I don't want to like lean on that. I would defer to that just so I don't say something I don't know anything about. Yeah. Yes, sister.
Going back to what you were saying earlier, I've heard that, like, there's like a certain narrative that like, oh, CVEs can be turned into a good thing if we make it like an equal opportunity thing, like if we use it to, you know, target white nationalists and so on, and also, and then like what like we were taught was like, no, like, we don't want it to be an equal opportunity.
Exactly.
Like, can you just touch on why that is?
Yeah, I mean, so there's that level of trust, right? And there's that level of protection. So if all of us have an equal opportunity to like a detrimental result, right, then that's not equal opportunity, right? Because within the scope of society, there are certain dynamics, right? And white nationalists are afforded more like leeway than a Muslim, right? So the system will already work in one group's favor, right? And then again, at the end of the day, you're still falsely infringing on people's privacy, right? And you're surveilling communities, right, for unreasonable reasons, right? So again, these indicators are unreasonable, right? Before we even start talking about whether it's lawful for them to arrest you on this reason or that reason, the reason itself, in and of itself, right, just like having or maintaining a beard or hijab, right? All of those reasons and down that list are unreasonable reasons to gauge radicalization, right? So like, and then applying these to another group, like what benefit does that do, right? Like for the sake of quote unquote preventing like extremism from like white nationalists, etc. There are other ways, right, to hold those different groups accountable, right? And again, there are other agencies and groups and organizations that are doing the work behind that, right? And it's a disservice to people, you know, being marginalized to say, oh, let's marginalize someone who isn't historically marginalized in our society in order to get you a fair playing field, right? You're still being marginalized at the end of the day. Any other questions? Okay, I'm gonna do, yes, Hasna.
Kind of following up on what you're mentioning about CVE. So I'll let Sule go, because I know you're leading this in trouble, but I'm gonna say what we're working on anti-CVE campaign, and we do have a regional circle here in Davis campaign against it. So if people are interested, if they're curious, if they want to learn more, Malham, Sule, myself, Tim Moore, and somebody else that are all working on that. It is something that we need more people to be engaged with. There was a 2-hour webinar right before this section that's recorded. If anybody's interested in learning about the specifics about like what CVE looks like on different campuses across the state of California and how they've implemented CVE funding to impact like how professors hold classes, the information they're getting in class, programs, things like that. That's all been discussed in that 2 hours of webinar, which I have access to, and these two should have access to as well. This one, inshallah, would like everyone to be relatively familiar with the idea of it moving forward.
There's also a toolkit that they compile goes through what CVE is and like the resources that we have to identify and spotting it.
Yeah, these are invaluable resources, you know, like in this time and age, this is something that students need to be aware of, right? Because although it also happens on college campuses, after you leave college, it'll still continue to happen in communities if you don't have the proper, again, toolkit and the awareness behind it. So I know MSA West and like PANA and like I think CARE, ALC, they're all working on this coalition. So it's definitely a huge resource because there are so many organizations that focus primarily on this work that have outlined this toolkit and like this this webinar that they did today. Okay. Yes.
Is it over or is it just?
It is. It is over.
Okay. So let's say in a hypothetical scenario, you work, law enforcement or a federal agent goes up outside your work, at home, at the mosque, any place really.
Yeah.
What, like, hey, hey, we think you might be, like, how would that interaction kind of look like?
4 words. I always recommend 4 words. Talk to my lawyer, right? We have cups that we like produce. I don't know if you guys have seen them. They're coffee mugs that say "No chai with the FBI," right? So essentially, there's a story behind that, right? There's a purpose. Like we wouldn't just make that. It's because we come, and especially a lot of people who are children of immigrants, we come from very hospitable societies, right? And even if it's your enemy, you honor, I guess, kind of honor them with respect, right? A lot of people invite the FBI in for tea, or they ask, like, oh, can I come in for tea, right? And people will invite them in saying, I have nothing to hide, right? So what ends up happening is once they enter, right, your door, everything they see, right, is admissible in evidence. So anything they see, right? So you don't let them in your house. So even when you open the door, right, if you see if it's, you know, like if you see it's an FBI agent, right, be like, can I please see your card, right? If it's really an FBI agent, right, you exit, close your door behind you, right, so they don't look inside, because they'll try to look inside. Sometimes they'll put their foot in the door, so you can't close the door, right? And you tell them, I'd like you to contact my attorney, please. And they'll probably be like, no, we just want to talk, right? We're not here, like you didn't do anything wrong. We're not here to, you know, incriminate you. We're not here to even ask. We just want to talk. You know, we're just kind of visiting the neighborhood. They'll say anything, and they can say anything. They don't have to tell you why they're visiting you, right? Tell them, I want to talk to my attorney, call CARE, file an incident report, say I was visited by the FBI, and you'll see how fast you'll get an attorney on it, right? That is literally the answer. Again, we talked about case-by-case basis. That is the answer for every single case in which you're visited by the FBI. Every single one, right? There's no exception. There's no like, oh, I just, you know, they'll be like, I just need a minute. I just need 30 seconds of your time, right? I just want to talk to you real quick. It won't take long, right? Nothing. You give them nothing.
No name, no height.
Nothing. Just your attorney's information. Or don't even give me your attorney. You say, if you would like to contact my attorney, right? Or my attorney will be contacting you. Can I have your card? My attorney will be contacting you, right? And then file an incident report. This is serious because so many people have been locked up for no reason whatsoever, right? For long periods of time, just because they answered 1 or 2 questions. Literally they were just a regular, like, Muslim dude that goes to the mosque, right? That goes to his job at Intel or Google or whatever, right? And they get visited, and they get locked up for no reason, right? So, another hand? You had a hand. Oh, okay. I don't think she didn't have a question.
My question was, if he's already been detained, if he's already been arrested, now, do those protections still apply, or are you still...
Ask for an attorney. Don't speak, just ask for an attorney. They say anything you say or do will be held against you in the court of law. They mean that.
You're right about Miranda, but then the question I have is, if you've already been Mirandized and you're already giving a statement...
Still, don't give a statement. Why are you giving a statement?
Because you've already been Mirandized.
Your statement can be, speak to my attorney. It's as simple as that. Because that's what they want you to believe. Oh, you're Mirandized, we got you. Now you have to answer our questions. No, my attorney can answer your questions. It's as simple as that. And I can't emphasize that enough. It's literally the difference between life or death sometimes. All right, my small plug. We have an event tomorrow in Sacramento. I don't know how many of you guys can make it out, right? To be Black Muslim narratives through poetry, right? We have some amazing local poets, and we're bringing a poet, Akhi Abu Bakr from Seattle, right, who I hear is an amazing poet. It'll be at Sac State in the University Union tomorrow from 6 to 9 p.m. So please come through, join us if you can. It'll be a great night, inshallah. And thank you, Jazakallah khair, for having me. Really appreciate your time. Y'all are awesome. It's like 10 o'clock. Like, that's pretty cool. I don't know if I would have ever come out to an event this late.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for the great presentation.
Thank you for having me.
We earlier passed out these packets, little surveys. So if you guys can fill